This is the story of a man, a mogul, and a whole lot of funeral homes. Meet Jeremiah O'Keefe, the man. He never intended to be a champion for independent funeral homes. He never intended to take down a funeral mega conglomerate.
This is a kind of private fight between Mr. Ray Lowen and myself.
Raymond Lowen, the mogul, chief executive of the Lowen Group. In the 90s, it was the second largest funeral home corporation in North America, the state of Mississippi, where Jeremiah O'Keefe's family has been burying people since the Civil War. It's also where O'Keefe took Ray Lowen to court with his lawyer, this guy, Willie Gary, a personal injury attorney from Florida. 8 million Baptists. Okay, the 8 million Baptists will make sense at some point, just hold on. A yacht, where Ray Lowen underestimated Jeremiah O'Keefe. But I'm getting ahead of myself, folks. Let's start at the beginning. Jeremiah O'Keefe was not happy. For generations, his family had been burying the dead of Biloxi, Mississippi. In addition to the funeral homes, he also owned Gulfport National Insurance Company. If you know anything about the funeral industry in the last half a century, you know it loves to sell you pre-need. Essentially, pre-need is when you pay a funeral home now for services you'll need later. Pre-need. Before you need it. Before you're dead, is what I'm saying.
Oh.
O'Keefe had agreements with other family-run funeral homes in the area that they would sell his pre-need insurance in their mortuaries as well. The O'Keefe family were big old funeral fish in Biloxi's small death pond. But then, the Lowen Group came to town. All the way from Canada, eh? And Ray Lowen was not the friendly neighborhood Canadian we all envision. He was no Rick Moranis.
Good day, welcome to the Great White North.
He was no Mike Myers. He was certainly no Leslie Nielsen.
Nice beaver.
Ray Lowen had also been raised in the funeral business. Born in Manitoba, Canada, he learned the funereal arts, embalming, burial, and care of bodies from his father.
And what is the thing that'll ruin a perfectly good dead body, it will?
And discovered that he had a flair for managing the funeral home's finances. He was ambitious and had an entrepreneurial talent for expansion. I started one small funeral home and I'm like, look at my entrepreneurial talent for expansion. But to put this in real perspective, let's do the numbers. It's a Kai Ryssdal reference? Anyone? In 1988, the Lowen Group, as Lowen's ever-expanding group of funeral homes was called, had 98 funeral homes and 5 cemeteries in both the US and Canada. By 1989, that number rose to 120 funeral homes and 10 cemeteries. By early 1990, they had 300 funeral homes and 25 cemeteries. And by September of 1995, around when the Lowen Group made their way down to Mississippi, they had 764 funeral homes and 172 cemeteries. Their revenue was in the ballpark of $600 million. Where did they get all of those funeral homes? Let's talk about the rise in corporate funeral behemoths in the 1990s. There was the Lowen Group, come down from the naughty north. There was Stewart Enterprises, out of Louisiana. And there was the biggest and baddest of them all, Service Corporation International, or SCI, out of Houston, Texas. Here's how it worked. These corporations would come to your state, hi, hello, sorry for your loss, and offer to buy independent funeral homes. If you were Frank Thompson of Thompson & Sons Mortuary, and you're getting on in age, and your loser son wants to be a librarian or firefighter instead of a mortician, getting bought out by a corporation for boku bucks sounds like an attractive proposition. As I said, SCI was the biggest of these corporations, but the Lowen Group had developed a reputation for being aggressive. Ray Lowen was determined to dominate the funeral home and cemetery industry, and by the 90s, he was well on his way. The Lowen Group would target a geographic area and start buying up independent funeral homes and cemeteries. I know what you're thinking. There aren't a bunch of funeral homes called SCI or Lowen, like McDonald's or Starbucks. Well, no, there wouldn't be, would there? The real trick is when the family-owned funeral home was bought, the family name and the independent optics were to remain intact. You would go to your local funeral home that your family had been going to for decades, having no idea that it was now owned by a Canadian corporation with Ray Lowen behind the scenes enforcing corporate practices, or normalization, as they called it. Normalization. Normalization meant making sure that every Lowen-owned funeral home was meeting financial expectations, and fast. There were shareholders to keep happy. The best way to achieve that goal was consolidation. The more market share a funeral home corporation owns in a given area, the more you can centralize operations. All embalmings can be done in one large care center, and caskets can be bought in bulk at a deep discount. So the corporation is saving a ton of money, and they can pass that savings on to the customer.
No, Caitlin.
Oh, no? They don't do that?
We don't do that.
Instead of offering the savings to the customer, they drive up the price. Ray Lowen called it
revenue enhancement.
Lowen funeral homes were expected to practice something called third unit target merchandising.
Revenue enhancement.
This is a technique that they've been teaching for years. It's kind of a psychological marketing game, banking on the fact that when grieving families come into a casket showroom to pick out a casket for their mom, let's say, they're going to feel pressure not to pick just the cheapest one available. In fact, so the third unit postulates, the family is going to bypass the two least expensive choices and go for the next up on the price ladder, the third unit. All Lowen funeral homes were expected to make the two least expensive caskets sort of expensive to start with, so the third casket up in cost would be even more expensive.
Revenue enhancement.
A survey was done comparing Lowen-owned funeral homes to still independent funeral homes in Texas. It found that an independent funeral home might charge around $863 for basic services, while a Lowen funeral home charged in the ballpark of $1,638. Twice as much.
Revenue enhancement.
A local funeral home in Amarillo, Texas charged $185 for embalming services, whereas a Lowen funeral home charged $425 for the same service. Funeral home owners in Mississippi described Lowen selling a burial vault that wholesaled for $940 for as high as $2,860 in an area where Lowen funeral homes held a monopoly.
Revenue enhancement.
Lowen was banking on the fact that a family, befuddled by grief, wasn't going to shop around to find the best price. The funeral industrial complex has been allowed to flourish for years due to that exact, true perception. Most families will never make more than one phone call to compare prices at different funeral homes. Lowen's overall business model made funerals inaccessible to a lot of people and pushed generations of family funeral homes out of business through intimidation and threats to build new funeral homes right next door to theirs and run them out of business. I am not saying that all family-owned funeral homes are bastions of perfect ethics. We know small businesses are just as capable of malfeasance. David and his parents were also allegedly illegally selling organs to medical schools and research centers, as well as the black market. But for the little guys, dealing with the Lowen Group was like going up against a juggernaut.
I'm the juggernaut, bitch!
But Jeremiah O'Keefe, he was no podunk small-town American funeral director ripe for exploitation by the big bad Canadian.
Hey, who brought the dog?
O'Keefe was the father of 13, a World War II hero, the former mayor of Biloxi, former member of the Mississippi House of Representatives, owner of 8 funeral homes and his insurance business, and he, frankly, didn't like what he was seeing. Now, long before the Lowen Group arrived on the scene, Jeremiah O'Keefe already had an enemy in the funeral business. If you think working with the somber realities of death and dying makes funeral home owners any less petty,
No, ma'am, you would be wrong. It does not.
O'Keefe's enemy was the Raymond Funeral Home. Journalist and author Eric Larson described the O'Keefes and Raymonds as the Hatfields and McCoys of funerals. If you died in Biloxi, you would be buried by Jeremiah O'Keefe. If you died in adjacent Gulfport, Bob Raymond would do the honors. But suddenly, here comes Ray Lowen into town, buying up Raymond Funeral Home, keeping the name of course, and another funeral home, Wright and Ferguson. For 16 years, Wright and Ferguson had used O'Keefe's pre-need insurance for their clients. But suddenly, they made the switcheroo and were using Raymond's pre-need insurance instead, since both funeral homes were now Lowen owned. O'Keefe felt this had unlawfully broken his business agreement, so he filed a lawsuit. Soon enough, the big maple leaf, Ray Lowen himself, came a-callin'. Remember the yacht? The 1990s in the corporate funeral industry was the time of wining and dining. Flights to Cancun, golf retreats on private planes, salmon fishing trips to Alaska. All activities beloved by older gentlemen of retirement age with funeral homes to sell. Especially flattering was when Bob Waltrip of SCI or Ray Lowen of the Lowen Group would take you on these trips themselves. You, their very important death friend. Ray Lowen was known for taking out and then bullying funeral home owners on his yacht. This was also his plan for Jeremiah O'Keefe. O'Keefe had dinner with Lowen on the yacht, and during that dinner, Lowen attempted to charm O'Keefe away from the silly lawsuit and get him to sell some of his funeral homes. He regaled O'Keefe with stories about his prowess as a businessman,
See, I can get 600 tablets of that for the same price as 300 of a name brand.
including how he had intimidated John Wright of Wright and Ferguson into selling his funeral home.
To brag about being able to intimidate somebody is not evidence of a gentlemanly sensibility.
O'Keefe says.
It told me he's an arrogant guy, that he's a hard pusher.
O'Keefe was not impressed, and he was not interested in selling, but he agreed to terms that explicitly included restoring his insurance agreement with the funeral homes now owned by Lowen. O'Keefe left the yacht, disembarked from the yacht, thinking that things had been resolved.
Shock me with that deviant behavior.
But please, nothing changed. Lowen continued selling pre-need, and O'Keefe was still out the business, so he went forward with his lawsuit. At this point, Lowen's executives got involved, negotiating a settlement where O'Keefe would sell Lowen 3 of his funeral homes, and in exchange, O'Keefe would actually acquire Lowen's pre-need insurance business. But then months passed, and Lowen never completed the deal. As it hung in limbo, O'Keefe was losing money fast and had to sell off funeral homes. O'Keefe began to realize that Lowen had never meant to honor their agreement. He was just going to wait for O'Keefe to go under and then buy up the fragments for nothing. Jeremiah O'Keefe was incensed with these
Predatory trade practices.
He wanted $5 million in damages. Ooh, $5 million. Seems like a lot of money, doesn't it? What an innocent time that was. But O'Keefe would need a sharp, unflappable lawyer to go up against Ray Lowen and his legal counsel. No stuffed shirt funeral industry lawyer would do. Oh no, he needed Willie Gary.
Meet Willie Gary! Oh, I've just been waiting, members of the jury, to speak my piece.
Willie Gary was a personal injury lawyer based in Florida, but with offices around the country, including Mississippi. He was a charismatic guy, and drawn to cases where he could go up against impossible odds and win.
Disney, Coca-Cola, Eastman Kodak may well wish they'd never heard of the name Willie Gary. He's asking for a mere $5 billion, and he's already taking heat for his chutzpah, his sheer nerve.
Born in Georgia in 1947, the Gary family were migrant farm workers. Despite those beginnings, and despite being a small man, Gary fought his way to a football scholarship in order to go to college, parlaying that tenacity into a law degree, work as a lawyer, and eventually his own law firm. To say Willie Gary was successful was putting it mildly.
The only thing better than a dream home is another one. Willie's building a 22,000 square foot weekend retreat. When completed, the bottom of its swimming pool will be emblazoned with the letter W.
He was listed as one of Ebony magazine's 100 most influential Black Americans. He had luxury cars, boats, multiple homes, his own custom Boeing 737 plane. Let's just say Willie Gary had his pick of legal work. So when Jeremiah O'Keefe first sent his lawyers to ask Gary to take lead on this case, he said no.
No.
There's not a lot of style and glamour in corporate funeral home lawsuits, let's be honest. It wasn't until O'Keefe himself went to Gary and asked him to take the case that he agreed. I flat out liked him. Even Gary's wife loved O'Keefe and said, "You've got to help him." So Willie Gary took the case. Years later, he would tell BuzzFeed News his strategy on this case.
Legally, I tried to crush.
Initially, Gary went to Lowen's people directly, offering to settle for the mere $5 million O'Keefe originally asked for. No, I'm kidding. You snooze, you lose. Willie Gary's in town, and the offer to settle was now $125 million. The Lowen Group basically ignored the offer and quietly hired an experienced trial lawyer of their own, Richard Sinkfield. I'm gonna note here that both Sinkfield and Gary are Black, as were 8 of the 12 jurors, as was the judge, James E. Graves. Graves. The judge's name was Graves. You can't make this stuff up. It was 2 Black men representing 2 white men in 1990s Mississippi. It's an interesting thing to note on its own, but I'm not making this a thing for no reason. Race would become a large part of this trial. From the onset, Willie Gary had a vision for how to present this case. When speaking to potential jurors in September of 1995, Gary had a framed photo of O'Keefe's entire family on display. He made sure O'Keefe's wife Annette was present, as well as many of their 13 adult children as possible. Each adult child stood up and was introduced to the jurors like a bunch of Mississippi Von Trapps. David, Kenneth, David, Kenneth. I don't know the kids' names. Gary portrayed O'Keefe as a family man, a throwback to a kinder, simpler society. The same little voice that told O'Keefe to go fight for America after Pearl Harbor was the same little voice that told him to fight against the mean Canadian who lied and cheated him.
You see, that little voice, members of the jury, has a name, and it's called faith. Faith in God. It's called pride. Pride in America.
O'Keefe was also portrayed as a longtime funeral professional who had served Black families just as readily as white families. At the trial, Gary even brought in Black politicians to endorse his not racist at all, totally one of the good white guys character. We've talked about this before, but the funeral business, even now, can be extremely segregated. Black funeral homes and white funeral homes. So explaining that O'Keefe was a man who was, quote, a friend of the Black community, both as a funeral director and politician, was a pivotal argument in front of a mixed jury in Mississippi. Furthermore, Willie Gary painted Ray Lowen, who wasn't even present at the beginning of the trial and was frankly uninterested, as a big, bad, foreign monopoly man coming in and making it impossible for average, hard-working folks to have a decent funeral.
This case is about gouging moms and pops who saved their life savings just to be able to be put away nicely.
The 2 teams of lawyers went back and forth. Lowen were like, "We didn't breach any contract." And Gary was like,
if you didn't breach any contract, why are you trying to settle?
Lowen's counsel were like, well, it wasn't really a contract. It was like, quote, an agreement to agree, which opened the door for Gary to argue that from the beginning, the Lowen Group just wanted to destroy O'Keefe's business and eat up the pieces. Lowen intended to monopolize the funeral home market and push families out of business and drive up prices.
Revenue enhancement.
Ray Lowen finally was forced to pay attention to this little lawsuit down in Mississippi. In October, he flew to Mississippi. His private plane actually ended up parked next to Willie Gary's private plane, which was named the Wings of Justice. It was factors like Lowen's plane, his infamous yacht, his helicopter, that would cause problems for the mogul in the eyes of the jury, especially when compared to good old boy O'Keefe. It's hard to hide one's net worth when you can land your helicopter on your yacht.
What, you can't? Oh my God, sad for you.
So forcefully was this point made at trial that apparently even the judge at some point was like, enough with the yacht, Mr. Gary. But Lowen's true fatal mistake, the nail in the coffin, if you will, and I think you will, was choosing to introduce Ray Lowen's relationship with the National Baptist Convention USA as a, quote, bid by Lowen to ingratiate itself with black jurors. Founded in 1886, the National Baptist Convention is the nation's oldest and largest African-American religious convention, and at the time of the trial, they boasted 8.2 million members. The National Baptist Convention held considerable sway over black American churches and cemeteries. Just as the trial had begun in September of 1995, the Lowen Group had finalized a deal to make Lowen the convention's death care provider of choice. The Lowen Group would train members of the National Baptist Convention churches to sell burial plots, vaults, and headstones in Lowen cemeteries. The sellers would earn a small commission, and Lowen would potentially rake in millions. Lowen saw this deal as evidence that he too was a friend to the black community. But critics, like Willie Gary, and the jury, and pretty much everyone else, saw it as Ray Lowen making even more money off the black Baptist community. The only person really winning was Lowen, by finding an angle into the powerful black funeral market. But to be fair, went the counterargument, it was a chance for the salespeople, pastors, and the Baptist Convention to make money. And surely they would also be able to sell things like viewings and embalmings and final care at Lowen-owned funeral homes. Oh, you're saying access to funerals at Lowen Funeral Homes was a deal he only cut with white funeral homes? Black community just got access to the cemeteries? Oh dear.
What are you going to do? Put grandma in a casket on your flatbed truck and drive around looking for a funeral home?
Actually, Counselor Gary, yes, it's called a family-involved or home funeral. And, okay, not the time? He continued,
Lowen was going to make $750 million a year off these folks, and they would be making peanuts. And they couldn't even go to his funeral home to have a funeral.
As the trial came to a close, thanks to Willie Gary's unrelenting examination of Lowen and his practices, the jury awarded Jeremiah O'Keefe $260 million. Said Ray Lowen about the verdict, "I was absolutely stunned. I thought, this can't be happening. But wait, there is more. Yet to come was the punitive damages phase of the trial. Punitive damages being awarded when you can show the defendant acted with malice or fraud. During this phase, Lowen's net worth would be evaluated. It was a sloppy affair, with Lowen's people making mistakes, like over the course of half an hour claiming net worth amounts for Lowen that swung by hundreds of millions of dollars. The economists Willie Gary brought in claimed the Lowen Group was worth $3 billion. In a bold move, and he was nothing if not bold, Gary asked the jury to award O'Keefe $1 billion in punitive damages. It took less than an hour for the jury to come back. They didn't award him $1 billion, but they did award Jeremiah O'Keefe $500 million, the highest number ever awarded in the state. By the way, they were one juror short of awarding the full $1 billion. The jury foreman would later say, Loewen was a rich, dumb Canadian politician who thought he could come down and pull the wool over the eyes of a good old Mississippi boy. It didn't work. Obviously, the Loewen Group wanted to appeal this decision, like right away, but the state of Mississippi required an appeal bond, basically money kept in safe holding while the appeal is being decided. That appeal bond has to be 125% of the amount of the judgment against Loewen. So, backs against the wall, they didn't appeal and settled with O'Keefe for $175 million. All O'Keefe wanted was $5 million, and that was a first offer. I bet he would have taken like $1,587,062. The trial and settlement payout marked the beginning of the end for Ray Loewen. During the trial, the Loewen Group, former darlings of the Canadian stock market, saw their stock prices suffer. At first, Ray Loewen just seemed in denial about the whole thing and kept aggressively buying all the funeral homes he could get his hands on. Still, the Loewen Group stock prices were not thriving. SCI, remember the biggest corporate funeral conglomerate ever, smelled blood in the water. SCI made several offers to buy the Loewen Group outright and assume all their debt. But Ray Loewen asked the board to reject these offers, calling it
a hostile takeover.
Loewen seemed to genuinely believe that if he just kept buying all the funeral homes, everything and the company would all be fine. By 1998, Ray Loewen was forced to step down as CEO, burdened with $2.3 billion in debt.
You bought too many funeral homes, Ray. The piper must be paid. These were funeral homes, not Beanie Babies.
Burdened with billions in debt, they filed to reorganize under the Chapter 11 bankruptcy code, and the Loewen Group emerged like a phoenix from the ashes as the Alderwoods Group. And in just a few years, the Alderwoods Group was acquired by SCI.
SCI will get ya.
SCI will get ya. They'll get ya. They'll get ya. And that, my friends, is how Jeremiah O'Keefe, Willie Gary, and 8.2 million Baptists took down Ray Loewen. Tell ya, when we first started researching this video, I was so proud of us. Who else would tell this story? Who else would bring you You should have seen my face when I learned the video we were working on was going to be a movie being made right now starring Jamie Foxx as Willie Gary and Tommy Lee Jones as Jeremiah O'Keefe. Of every video we've done, I mean every single video, this is the least likely to be made into a big Hollywood film? Well, I guess the industry has finally caught up and realizes the true entertainment value in 1990s courtroom dramas on the topic of corporate funeral home monopolies. Something we have known all along, you and I. May I come to the premiere?
No!
And a final thank you to patrons for, as always, letting me live my weird dreams. If you're a patron and you haven't been visiting the Patreon, there's a lot of really good, well, really good content. It's me just talking. Would it truly be ethical to not tell you that I am in a bathroom?
Revenue enhancement.
revenue enhancement, 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 revenue, revenue, revenue enhancement, revenue, revenue, revenue enhancement, yeah, revenue enhancement, revenue enhancement, revenue enhancement, revenue, 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 revenue enhancement, revenue enhancement, revenue enhancement, revenue enhancement, revenue, 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 revenue enhancement. Revenue enhancement, revenue enhancement, revenue enhancement, revenue enhancement, revenue, 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 revenue enhancement, yeah, 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 yeah.